The rifle was already cocked when Sarah Whitfield opened the door that night, and the words she spoke into the rain-soaked darkness would echo through the rest of her days. "Please don't come inside, Mr. Garrett. I know why you're here, and I'm asking you, for the last time, to turn that horse around and ride away from my family." The town of Cutter's Ridge sat in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, a scattering of clapboard buildings and dirt streets that turned to red mud whenever the rains came down hard from the north. Sarah Whitfield had buried her husband Thomas 2 winters before, when a rockslide during a timber haul had crushed the wagon and taken him from her and their young son Jacob in the space of a single terrible afternoon. She had been 26 years old then, with a boy of 5 clinging to her skirts and a homestead of 80 acres that the bank in town said she had no business trying to keep. She kept it anyway. She rose before the sun each morning to milk the 2 cows that remained to her. She mended fences with her own hands until her palms bled through the gloves, and she sold eggs and preserves at the mercantile to keep food on the table through winters that seemed determined to bury her along with her husband. Jed Garrett was a different sort of story entirely, and not a kind one. Men in Cutter's Ridge did not speak his name without lowering their voices, the way folks do when they are talking about a rattlesnake they have seen sunning itself too close to the schoolhouse. He had ridden with a rough outfit down in the nations for the better part of a decade, and though nobody could point to a hanging offense with his name attached to it, everybody knew the sort of company he had kept and the sort of things that company did. He had come to Cutter's Ridge 2 years back with a hard face, a harder reputation, and money enough to buy the old Pruitt spread that bordered Sarah's land to the east. He kept to himself. He drank alone at the Silver Spur Saloon, spoke only when spoken to, and there was a coldness behind his pale eyes that made the barkeep's hand shake a little when he poured his whiskey. Loneliness had settled into that man like frost into a fence post, deep and permanent, and it had made him mean in the way that wounded animals are mean, snapping at anything that came too close to the hurt. He had first seen Sarah Whitfield at the mercantile on a spring morning, her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose from its pins as she counted coins for a sack of flour, and something in him that he thought had died years before in a Texas gunfight had stirred back to life. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself the same thing the second time he saw her and the third, and by the 10th time he had stopped telling himself anything at all because he knew good and well what it was, and he did not have the first idea what to do with a feeling like that in a heart as calloused as his had become. So he did what men like Jed Garrett often do when tenderness catches them by surprise. He turned it into something rougher. He began riding past her property line more often than any honest errand required. He began appearing at the edge of her fields when she was chopping wood, saying little, watching much, his jaw tight and his eyes unreadable, and there was a hunger in the way he looked at her that frightened her more than any outlaw's gun ever could have, because she could not tell if it was love or something closer to possession, and out on that lonesome frontier, a widow with a young son had learned the hard way that the difference could cost her everything. It was Jacob, in truth, who first softened the edges of Jed Garrett's granite heart, though Jed himself would not have admitted it even under oath. The boy was 7 that autumn, small for his age, with his father's dark curls and a curiosity that ran faster than his legs could carry him. He had wandered onto Garrett land one afternoon chasing a rabbit through the brush, and when a thunderstorm rolled down off the mountains faster than any child could outrun, it was Jed Garrett who found him soaked and shivering under a lone cottonwood tree, more frightened of the lightning than of the hard-faced stranger who scooped him up onto his saddle without a word and rode him home through the storm. Sarah had come running out into the rain when she heard the hoofbeats, her heart near stopping in her chest at the sight of her son slung across a stranger's horse, and when Jed set the boy down gently on the porch and said only, "Found him under the cottonwood, ma'am, he's cold but he's whole." She had seen something in his eyes that did not match the reputation the town had given him. But reputations, once planted, grow roots deep and stubborn, and Sarah Whitfield had learned to trust caution over hope, because hope had already broken her heart once before. That should have been the end of it, a small kindness rendered and quietly forgotten. But Jed Garrett could not seem to stay away after that. He began leaving things at her gate, a brace of quail he had shot, a sack of cornmeal, once a small carved horse he had whittled by lamplight for the boy, though he never once knocked to see it received, as if he could not bear to be thanked, or perhaps could not bear to be refused. Sarah did not know what to make of him. Some days she found herself grateful, and other days she found herself afraid, because a man who watched a woman the way Jed Garrett watched her, silent and burning and unspoken, was a man capable of anything if that silence ever broke. The whole town seemed to sense a storm building between the Whitfield homestead and the old Pruitt spread, and gossip traveled through Cutter's Ridge the way brush fire travels through dry prairie grass, fast and hot and impossible to contain. The trouble came to a head on a night in late October, when a hard rain had been falling since noon and the road into town had turned to a river of mud. Jed Garrett had spent the afternoon at the Silver Spur, and though he was not a man given to drink, that day something had cracked open in him, some old wound from a childhood he never spoke of, a mother who had left and a father who had used his fists more than his words, and the whiskey had loosened the chains he kept wrapped around his heart. He rode to the Whitfield homestead that night not with violence in his mind. He would swear later, but with something nearly as dangerous, which was desperation, the desperation of a lonely man who could no longer bear to watch a woman he loved from a distance and say nothing. He pounded on her door in the driving rain, and when Sarah opened it a crack, lamp in hand, Jacob asleep behind her, she saw a man unraveling, his hat dripping, his eyes wild with a longing he no longer had the strength to hide, and he told her, voice rough as gravel, that he could not stand it any longer, that he wanted her, that he had wanted her since the day at the mercantile, and he took a step toward the threshold as though the years of silence had finally broken something loose in him that could not be put back. It was then that Sarah Whitfield raised the old rifle that had belonged to her husband, her hands trembling but her voice steady as stone, and spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. "Please don't come inside," she said, and there was no cruelty in it, only iron, the iron of a woman who had already lost one man to this hard land and would not lose her son to fear or foolishness. "I know why you're here, Jed Garrett, and I have seen kindness in you same as I have seen the cold in you. But a woman alone with a child cannot open her door to a man's wanting, only to his character, and you have shown me plenty of the first and precious little of the second. You ride on home now, and you think on whether you are a man capable of gentleness, or only a man capable of taking, because until I know the answer to that, this door stays closed." The words struck him harder than any blow he had taken in all his years of hard living, because they were true, and true words cut deeper than lies ever could. He stood there in the rain a long moment, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of them, and then without a word he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back into the storm, and Sarah closed the door and slid the bolt and sat down at her table and wept, not out of fear, but out of the terrible loneliness of having to be strong all the time, of having no one to lean on, of wondering if she had just turned away the only man in 100 miles who might have loved her son as his own. Jed Garrett did not come around for many weeks after that night, and the whole town noticed the change in him, though few understood its cause. He stopped drinking at the Silver Spur. He began attending the little clapboard church on Sunday mornings, sitting alone in the back pew, hat in his hands, listening to Reverend Alden speak of grace and second chances with an intensity that made the old preacher take special notice of him. He rode into the hills for days at a time, and when he returned, there was something different in his bearing, something quieter, as though he were wrestling with the ghosts of his own past out there among the pines and the granite peaks, and slowly, gradually coming to terms with them. He began helping neighbors he had never spoken 2 words to before, mending a widow's roof after a windstorm, breaking a wild colt for old man Hutchins who had thrown his back, and the town of Cutter's Ridge began to whisper a different kind of gossip about him, the kind that spoke of change rather than danger. Winter came hard that year, the worst any of the old-timers could remember, snow piling up against the fence rails until the cattle could barely find grass beneath it, and it was during the cruelest stretch of that winter, when a blizzard howled down from the Bitterroots for 3 days without mercy, that fate gave Jed Garrett the chance to prove the truth of Sarah's challenge. Jacob had slipped out during a break in the storm to check on a calf he had grown fond of, wandering farther than he meant to in the blinding white, and when the wind rose up again sudden and fierce, the boy was lost, swallowed by a wall of snow so thick a man could not see his own hand before his face. Sarah's screams carried across the frozen fields to the old Pruitt spread, carried by a wind that seemed determined that night to either save the boy or claim him, and Jed Garrett, hearing that broken sound, did not hesitate for even a heartbeat. He saddled his horse in the teeth of the blizzard, tied a rope from his saddle horn to his own waist so he would not lose himself in the whiteout, and rode out into a storm that any sensible man would have called a death sentence. He searched for hours, calling the boy's name into a wind that tore the words from his mouth before they had traveled 10 feet. His hands numb, his face raw and bleeding from the ice, and more than once he nearly turned back, nearly accepted that the storm had already taken what it meant to take. But he thought of Sarah's face in the lamplight, of her trembling hands on that rifle, of the truth in her words that he had spent his whole life being a man capable of taking and never once proving himself a man capable of giving, and something in him refused to quit. He found Jacob at last curled against the lee side of a fallen cottonwood, the very same tree where he had found him once before, half frozen, his lips blue, his small body shaking uncontrollably, and Jed Garrett wrapped the boy inside his own coat, pressed him against his chest for whatever warmth his own battered heart could offer, and turned his horse back toward the rope line he had strung, walking the animal slow and careful through a whiteness that had no up nor down nor any direction a man could trust. They reached the Whitfield homestead near dawn, both of them half frozen, and when Sarah threw open the door and saw her son alive in the arms of the man she had turned away in the rain, something broke loose in her chest that she had kept locked tight since the day they buried Thomas. She pulled Jacob inside to the fire and wrapped him in every blanket the house held, and when she turned back to thank the man on her porch, she found him swaying on his feet, his strength spent entirely in the saving of her boy, and she caught him before he fell and half dragged him to the warmth of the hearth, and that night, for the first time since her husband's death, she prayed with her whole heart, not for herself, but for the recovery of a man the whole town had called mean and lonely, and whom she now understood to be neither, only wounded, only waiting all his life for someone worth healing for. Jed Garrett's fever broke on the third day, and when his eyes opened to find Sarah Whitfield sitting beside his bed, dark circles beneath her eyes from 3 sleepless nights of nursing him, Jacob curled asleep against her side. He understood in that moment that he had been given something he had never once believed himself worthy of, which was a second chance, not from the law, not from the town, but from his own battered soul, and from the grace of a woman brave enough to demand better of him than the world ever had. He did not speak of love that morning, not yet, for he had learned enough in that long winter to know that love proven slowly was worth more than love declared in a storm, and so instead he simply reached for her hand, and she let him take it, and that small quiet gesture said more than any words spoken at her door months before ever could have. Spring came to Cutter's Ridge the way it always did, stubborn and slow, and then all at once, the snow melting off the bitterroots in rushing silver streams, the prairie grass pushing up green through the mud, and by the time the wildflowers had claimed the hillsides, the whole town had watched Jed Garrett become a different man entirely, a man who tipped his hat to the ladies at the mercantile, who taught Jacob to whittle proper on the porch of an evening, who stood beside Sarah Whitfield at church with his hat in his hands, and something like peace settled finally into his weathered face. They were married that June beneath the same cottonwood tree where he had twice found her son, the whole town turning out to witness it, because there is nothing folks on the frontier love more than watching a hard story turn gentle, watching a mean and lonely man become, through kindness both given and received, a husband and a father worthy of the name. Now, dear friends watching this story unfold, I would love to know where in the world you are joining us from tonight, and what lesson this tale of the Old West has left stirring in your heart, whether it be the power of second chances, the strength of a mother's courage, or the quiet truth that even the coldest heart can be thawed by patience and grace. Please leave your answer in the comments below, for it warms the storyteller's heart to know how far these old frontier tales can travel. And if this story of a mean and lonely cowboy transformed by love, of a brave widow who demanded better before she offered her heart, and of a small boy saved twice beneath the same lonesome cottonwood tree has touched something deep within you tonight, then please, take a moment now to like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances, leave a comment to let us know, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and redemption straight from the heart of the American frontier, because somewhere out on that endless Montana prairie, beneath that same wide sky, Jed and Sarah Garrett raised their family together, proof enough that even in the hardest, loneliest corners of this world, love and grace can still ride in through the storm.